Hey guys, so the number one thing I think that are grown, sorry there's a frog in the greenhouse, but the number one thing that's grown in America is by most amateur gardeners are the tomatoes, and I grow more tomatoes than just about anything else. But what we often do is we end up going to our local hardware store or garden center and just buying tomato plant after tomato plant. I'm going to show you a way that you can take one tomato plant and turn it into an entire garden of tomatoes. I'll often do this. I'll have a particular variety I really like. I'll only buy one plant, and this is not from seed, by the way. This is a totally different method. So you can start with one plant and fill your entire garden with varieties you like, or if you just don't want to go out and buy a lot of different tomatoes and you just have a certain type you like. Anyways, it's an easy way to do it, and I'll show you step by step along the way. Now, the first step in doing this, you want to only do this with a disease-free tomato plant. You don't want to start with a plant that already has a problem to begin with, because you're just going to pass that genetic trait onto the following tomato plants you create. So just remember, you're wanting the healthiest looking tomato plant possible. Now, this one absolutely needs to be pruned. But the great thing about this method, you're going to create new tomato plants from something you might throw in your compost pile, or if you're not doing compost, you might actually throw it in the trash. So this is creating something you would normally throw away into a whole new plant. So the first thing you're going to look for is any of the suckers or side shoots. If you look carefully here, you'll see in between these two branches, you'll see this sucker forming right here. And this can become an entirely new tomato plant. And you're not required to put this in water and wait and wait and wait. You can plant this directly, and I'm going to give you every step of how to do this. So this one plant could become an entire garden of tomato plants in a very short amount of time. And when you compare it to starting from seed, this will be a huge head start of getting exactly the plant you want. So you're just cloning and duplicating your original plant. Now, rule number one, and the most important thing, which a lot of people may forget about or just fail to do, is going to lead to a massive failure in your project here. So just remember, you want your scissors to be extra sharp, and you want them to be clean. If you've been using them somewhere else within the last 24, 48 hours, and you think that what you were doing, you might have been cutting away a diseased branch or limb from another tomato plant or anything in the garden, you want to sterilize them. So you can either use Listerine or rubbing alcohol, just dip it down in there and then wipe it good. So just make sure you do that, because if you do transfer disease from one plant to the other, it's going to be a total failure in creating new tomato plants. Now, in this particular potted tomato plant, I'm ready to put it into the ground, but before I do that, I want to take some cuttings of side shoots like this one right here, and also the suckers that I showed you earlier. So we just want to make sure that we get a really, like I said, a sharp pair of scissors that have been sterilized. Remove that and try not to do any damage to it. Now, if the side shoot does have flowers on it, you need to make sure that you remove those, because you don't want the new cutting that you've just taken, you don't want it putting energy into trying to grow those tomatoes from those flowers. You want to make sure that you focus that energy into root growth. So we want to remove all of the lower branches and any leaves. Remember, flowers too, we don't want to leave any of those on there. And you can, even the things that you're cutting off, you can attempt to do that as well. You can make tomato plants out of these, but what I'm wanting to do is I want to demonstrate showing you a very small sucker, turning it into a tomato plant, and something like this side shoot. So we're just removing the bottom half of all branches and leaves. We don't want the plant to be overly stressed, so we're just going to do that. We're just taking off all branches out of the lower half. I think we're okay by leaving that branch on there. So basically, it's this bottom one half where we've removed all branches, all leaves. And again, there's no flowers on this, but if there were, I would recommend removing all those, because that energy needs to be focused into root growth. Now, you need a well-draining mix in your pot or in your garden. You'll need to remove any really heavy clay soil. If you're trying to do this into a heavy clay soil, it's not going to work well. So you want something that drains well. So if you have to remove a large amount of soil in that area, or if you have raised beds, make sure it's in equal parts of peat, compost, and perlite. Now, if you don't make your own compost, I think Black Cow really is great, because it is a composted manure, very low odor, and it works great. So those three things are what you're going to need, whether you're using a pot or if you're doing it in a raised bed. But again, just regular soil in your backyard may not work very well, so make sure it's well draining by doing those three combinations or that combination. I've got a video where I showed how to make your own soil, and I'll put a link to that right here. Now, I try to never throw these pots away because I always find a use for them somewhere down the road. So just remember, you're going to need to do this even in a small cutting like I showed you, this little tiny sucker that was growing. We're going to put it in a much larger pot than you would probably think it needs, 6 to 8 inches pot. So that way it will be able to really send out roots, and so you'll know once it starts to grow really well that it won't outgrow its pot quickly. You could probably leave it into the pot halfway through the growing season, but just as soon as you see a lot of new growth, that's when you're going to want to transplant. So just remember, if you're starting in pots, make sure it seems like it's an oversized pot. Now, you don't want to put this into dry soil. You want the soil to be moist but not soggy, so you can use something like a misting bottle like this and just kind of feel for the soil. If you have a pH meter, and I have one in the greenhouse somewhere, some of those also have moisture meters built into them. So you want the soil to be moist but not soggy, because that can cause a problem and failure in your cutting very quickly. Now, this is a completely optional step. I've been using rooting hormones for different things around the yard where I'm taking azalea cuttings or hydrangea, but if you want to use a rooting hormone, like I said, it's completely optional. You'll just take some out, maybe just a small amount in a spoon. You don't want to dip your cutting into there because you could contaminate it the next time you use it. So just remember, just put it in a very, maybe something like a bottle cap, something really small, and dip the end of your cutting into the rooting hormone, and that might work better for you, but I've found that my success works even without it. So like I said, that's a completely optional step. Now, I always plant these deep, and that usually means at least half of the cutting. So something like this that's so small, this small sucker I got, I'm going to plant it all the way up there to that leaf. Something like this, that first branch that's sticking out, I'm going to plant it that deep. We want it as deep as possible. Now, you're not only confined to planting it vertically, you can also plant it horizontally and just get a gentle bend, so that way it will have all this space for roots. But either way, if your soil is really limited, you don't have a very deep pot, you can always bend it a little bit, or if you're using raised beds, you can bend it like that and just put a small, something like a chopstick where it would support it rather than it flopping back down on the ground. So just remember, vertical or horizontal, but just remember, you want at least half of your cutting to be in the soil, and also press down on the soil to eliminate any pockets of air that might be in there. Now, when you go to water it the first time, you want to do a very slow watering. These Orbit sprayers are really good, these hose end attachments, and it's got a mist feature, and you can do a very, very gentle misting spray. You can just take something like a fork or a stick, just kind of support it like that and allow it to do like a 4 to 5 minute spray if you don't want to sit there and wait. But generally you want the soil, the stem that's under the soil, to be very moist, but you don't want the soil to be soggy. So again, that moisture meter will help you out as well. So just a nice moist soil, and you can stick your finger in there. You'll know if it feels too soggy, and you'll get the hang of it after doing a lot of cuttings. Now, this next tip is not something I have a huge problem with because there is a massive amount of humidity in my area from the very get-go, but you can buy these very inexpensive plastic domes to put over it. You want to make sure you do this in the shade. You don't want the plant to, these domes, to sunlight to be hitting, because it gets really hot really fast. And you can have air exhaust at the top, but still, even with that, it can get really hot in these really quick. So if you're planting it in an open spot in your garden and you don't want to have to dig it up and transplant it to another area from a shady spot, then you're going to need to take something like the lid of a plastic tub or something like that and support it with 2 5-gallon buckets, and just make sure this stays in the shade the first 3 to 5 days before you remove it, because you want a humid, moist environment for the tomato cutting to really take off well. Now, a lot of people are not aware of shade fabric, but this fabric can be bought online. I'll put a link to it, as I do with all the products I talk about. But shade fabric, if you have a large area where you're doing a lot of cuttings and you don't want to have to do the trick with the 2 buckets and the plastic lid, you can buy a large piece of shade fabric and support it in all 4 corners, because you want bright but indirect light. Also, the shade fabric comes in different intensities. You can have 90% shade down to, I think, 20% or maybe even 10%. So just remember that shade fabric, if you're doing a large area, you can just build some supports for it, and you don't have to worry about leaf wilt and sun scorching with the initial start of your tomato cuttings, especially if you're doing a large number of tomato cuttings and you don't want them to die quickly. Now, I have a extensive irrigation system around my vegetable garden, but that wasn't the way it always was. I started out with a very inexpensive device like this. It hooks up to your hose tap, and you can schedule it to water once or twice a day for a very short duration of time. Remember, you want that soil to be moist but not soaked. So If you're really busy like I am, and you might forget a day or two, and of course all your cuttings will die and wilt very quickly. So buying these type of programmable timers, and this one's not expensive, again I'll put a link down below, but you want to make sure that that moist stays consistently, you want to make sure that that soil stays consistently moist is what I'm trying to get out, because the drying out is going to kill it faster than anything. Of course, intense sun will kill it, but of course that's a secondary effect to drying out. So just remember, buy something like this if you're going to do a lot of cutting, so it'll save you a lot of time, and you can hook up a lot of, maybe a dripper hose or some of the micro irrigation things. I think I've got a video where I actually talked about micro irrigation, and if I can find it, I'll be sure and link it right there. So you want to keep a close eye on it as much as you can, and if you start to see leaf wilt, take something like this and put a very small amount. I like to use, some people will say Miracle Grow. I've really gotten away from Miracle Grow. I actually like Schultz because it has a super high NPK number, that P being phosphorus, and that's what helps with root formation. I put just a very small amount, maybe a quarter of a teaspoon in my water, and I'll mist it very lightly at the end of the day, not during the sunny part of the day, but just as the sun's going down, I'll mist it in the evening, and that can speed up root formation, because that NPK number, the P in NPK, is going to make a massive difference with root formations early on. Now there's a lot of variables involved in doing this. It could start to form really heavy roots in as little as 7 days, and it could take as long as 21 days. But two ways you can tell that the roots have started to form. The easy way is just to look for new leaf growth anywhere on your cutting, and you'll see them because they'll be a little bit lighter. The other way is just give it a gentle tug, and if you feel resistance, you know you have some roots forming. If it starts to come out of the soil, don't tug it as hard as you can, but just barely pull on it. If you feel that resistance, you know you have roots forming, and just let it keep going and keep doing what you're doing. Now once that you've discovered you have roots and you have evidence of that happening, you want to slowly start introducing more sunlight. You don't want to just suddenly rip the plastic cover off or the shade fabric and just let the full sun hit it. You want to do that over a period of 3 to 5 days, giving a little bit more sun each day until it's able to take that massive amount of sun. That, like me, our sun is very intense starting in May. So just remember, you want to do that gradually. Once you've discovered you do have roots forming. So transplanting is optional if you use a large enough pot. If you use something like this, you're probably going to be forced to go into a larger pot or into your garden. So just remember that you need to think out in advance, depending on how many tomatoes you're starting. If you're starting huge numbers of cuttings, then maybe you do want to do something like this, because it's a lot of work to have to do that. But anyways, something like this, it could literally grow if you keep it pruned to the right size and don't let it get out of control. You can leave it in a pot this size, but I always recommend going into the garden, because I have some really rich soil that I've added with the black cow compost. Now if you are going to put this into a bigger pot or even into your garden, you want to plant it deep again. You don't want to plant it at the same depth. If you're going to all that trouble, you might as well go a little bit deeper, and if you don't have that much soil in your pot or raised bed, turn it sideways and let it form roots that way. But just remember that the deeper you plant it, the more roots that will form, and the happier you'll be with the results. So something about this size, I might actually go up another half, remove all these leaves and limbs at the lower level, and allow roots to form all over that area. So staking is the most critical thing when it comes to tomatoes, because you want to have for them to have support. You don't want them growing out all around the ground. I've taken some electrical conduit and electrical wire. This is very inexpensive wire that's used for pet containment system. The reason I chose yellow, it's easy to put my clips on there. That I'll put a photograph of the clip, but I use a very special clip that allows me to clip it all the way up, and it will grow quite well on that. So I still use some of the steel tomato cages, but I've opted to do this because I can grow so much higher and I get a much bigger yield. So staking and having support trellises like this is so important. Now mulching can be the difference between your tomato plant surviving or not surviving. This particular type of mulch is the best that I've found. I like to put it in about 1.5 to 2 inches layer. It stops any weeds from growing in, and it also helps retain moisture up underneath it. This is called soil conditioner, and the only place I found it is Lowe's. So it's a very finely ground pine bark, and it's really become my favorite. I've tried everything you can imagine. I've tried larger pine bark, I've tried hay, I've tried pine straw, and this is the one I like best because I think it looks the best, but it also works better than any of the others I mentioned. Now, a lot of people want to get away from synthetic fertilizers, but it's just really critical that you use something with that high phosphorus count. And the nitrogen will help a lot of leaf growth, but you want more growth in the roots, and you want more blooms appearing on your tomato plant, which ultimately become tomatoes. So if you don't want to use something like this, you want to go the completely organic route. Use bone meal because it also has a very high phosphorus count. So in my vegetable garden, a lot of the tomato plants are not actually purchased. They're actually clone plants, and it's just a way to get a free plant without waiting something having to start from seed, which is a very slow and long and drawn out process, and you can have a lot of issues with damping off and things like that. So just remember, the best option if you want to clone a tomato plant, just take a cutting and follow all of those steps, and you'll have more tomatoes than you can even eat. So I really believe this is the best method to get tomatoes. If you have a plant you really like, or from year to year you do save seeds and you start them in something like a greenhouse like this, you can do this method of cloning where you don't have to purchase tomato plants forever, and you'll just have more variety than you could ever imagine. Especially if you're like me, if you find one that you really like and you want to save that plant, save the seeds, start it in the greenhouse, and then once it starts growing well, if you have one that's really taking off, take some cuttings from it. So guys, I really appreciate you watching. If you have any questions about this video or any previous video, please become a public subscriber first so I can put you ahead of everyone else that's leaving tons and tons of comments. It's not that it's a priority, it's just when you get 100 comments sometimes a day, it's nearly impossible to answer them all. So guys, I really appreciate you watching. Have a great day.